So actually, it is faster than I thought.
To start right now?
We're live now, yeah. We're,
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So hello to everyone. So for those of you who don't know, the School of Materialist Research is an education and research inter-university grassroots initiative, a grassroots platform that offers integrated credit programs, seminars, special programs, and research initiatives that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, the Department for Architecture, Theory, and Philosophy of Technics at TU Vienna, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven, and serves as a global hub for education, research, and experimentation at the intersection of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. So now about our lecturer and our professor today. So we have the brilliant Daniel Sacilotto, and he teaches in critical studies at the California Institute of the Arts and in arts and design at California State University San Bernardino. His research focuses on the relation between realism and utopianism in contemporary European philosophy and post-colonial Latin America. He is the author of Universality and Utopia, the 20th century Peruvian socialist indigenista tradition, 2023, published by Anthem Press, and then Structure and Thought towards a Theory of Representational Cognition, 2024, published by Northwestern Press. And today his lecture will be on Materialism and Eschatology, a genealogy of modern Thanatropism. I hope I got that right. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Isidora. And thank you to the organizers as well for making this introductory session, open session. So this is the first time I've done one of these, and I generally, what I would think of doing is to try to introduce the topics that we will be dealing with in the seminar coming up, Thanatropism and Eschatology, and simply to try to give you a sort of conceptual background of the motivations behind the questions we're going to be raising with regards to the seminar, and also to try to explain some of the fundamental concepts and make references to the authors that we will be dealing with in a passing manner. But I would like to use this opportunity to sort of lay a historical, conceptual, philosophical background, making some references to the arc of post-Kantian philosophy in particular, to try to localize the nature of the project that the seminar will be dealing about. In short, this seminar is very much an extrapolation and extension of research that led to the publication of my second book, which Isidora was mentioned in passing. This book is an exploration really on representation and the critiques of representation leveraged in the post-Kantian philosophical context, both in the analytic and continental traditions in the 20th century, in the name of a superior realism or materialist perspective. And in this course of inquiry, in this course of challenging representation and disputing representation, the representational image of thought, as Deleuze would put it, which animates modern philosophical epistemology, we find several attempts to actually equate death or finitude with the lever or with the central concept that is going to allow us to access some form of materiality, mind-independent reality, you name it. So the examination into thanatropism and into eschatological narratives within philosophy that place death, finitude, other subsidiary concepts such as extinction at the center of philosophical inquiry is actually instrumental in a broader and more capacious ambition to try to reconstitute the foundations for materialism. And that is the true desideratum of my exploration. It's not simply an attempt to reconstruct the genealogy of modern Thanatropism in the abstract for purely, let's say, historiographical purposes, or to understand the history of ideas that develops in philosophy, psychoanalysis, in its philosophical import on its own sake, nor is it simply an examination of different narratives concerning human finitude, the finitude of life, or an inversion of vitalist narratives. It is furthermore a strategy, a methodological strategy. Thanatropism and eschatology become strategies for reconstituting the valences of realism and materialism in philosophy. And this is done in different registers. Sometimes it acquires a quasi-epistemological scope. Sometimes it is done in a phenomenological manner, sometimes in a psychoanalytic register, sometimes in a bluntly metaphysical or ontological register. So another thing that the seminar will do is to explore how it is that these eschatological narratives, as it were, become reconfigured, displaced, inscribed in all these different methodological approaches, each of which provides a different quote-unquote strategy to, once again, accept a materialist account. One of the things I want to do today, in the time that I will have, is to provide a sort of elevator pitch introduction into this terrain of questions, methodologies, and authors of post-Kantian philosophy, essentially, so as to better understand the set of questions we'll be raising, and also how it is that these different registers of explanation and philosophical quote-unquote exploration address the question of death, finitude in its own way. I will be relatively pedagogical today, as opposed to mostly, it's exploratory. So what I would like is simply to begin. I will have a PowerPoint to help us navigate this terrain of ideas. I will be introducing some concepts and work my way quasi, let's say, conceptually, in the sense of trying to clarify what I understand and we will be understanding as working hypotheses with regards to a set of important and fundamental concepts that I've been mentioning in this brief elevator pitch introduction. So without further ado, allow me to just begin projecting. And please, if anybody in the chat or, I'm sorry, anybody present has any questions as I am moving along, either concerning the concepts or the seminar itself, I'm happy to be interrupted at any moment and to answer your questions. We will also be having, after I'm finished with this basic exposition, engaging in a kind of Q&A session for anybody that wants to ask any further questions. But without further ado, let me begin projecting. Give me 1 second, please. So as the title mentions, this is supposed to be, the title formulates the spirit of the seminar in, by making an appeal to this term genealogy, which, as you know, has been popularized by Foucault, but it is traced back to Nietzsche, if not earlier. And the idea is not here, actually, as I mentioned, to do a historical survey exhaustively of anything that can deserve to be called genealogy, or a genealogy of Thanatropism in the exhaustive sense, since such a thing would take, of course, far too long. Rather, what I have decided to do, following through with, again, the spirit of the book, is to emphasize specific moments in the development of Thanatropism in philosophy that I believe are of specific importance for the purposes of the reconstitution of materialism. And in that context, let me begin by talking a bit about the incipient historical context, philosophical context, in which this question begins to acquire relevance. And that is, of course, as I mentioned already, the modern period, the modern philosophical period beginning in the 17th century or late 16th century, and the concomitant vector of disenchantment that sometimes is associated with modern philosophy. One of the most let's say, traditional things that is said about modern philosophies, that it initiates a vector of secularization, a vector of liberation and progressivism that detaches philosophy progressively but surely from its old scholastic, medieval, theological modes of thought, and that therefore it begins to slowly unravel the old metaphysics and to put in its place a picture of the world and a picture of philosophy attuned to the modern scientific worldview. That is to say, the worldview that begins to take shape and to become organized before our eyes, that was laid out by Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, Leibniz, etc. The revolutions, of course, in cosmology and in physics first, but which then would become extended across all of the natural sciences and then in the social sciences. And perhaps more recently in our own time, we could say in computer science and the informational sciences, which will have a surprisingly important role to play in the story that I want to say when we talk about information theoretic extensions of physics to think about thanatropic entropism and an ontology of entropy informed by information theoretic approaches to thermodynamics, for example. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, first of all, modern philosophy as a vector of secularization places the question of human finitude at the center. Now, of course, this is itself an extension of a scholastic motif. The question of human finitude, what happens with the human after it dies, what is its finite condition on earth, has been a topic of philosophical interest before the modern period, but it acquires a particular intensity and centrality in the modern period. In the work of Kant in particular, I think this question acquires a properly central dimension in defining the propriety of the human. It's not just an existential predicament, finitude, for Kant, as you know, but it actually pertains to something that fundamentally separates the human in the ontological and epistemic orders. And it's specifically the finite intuition that is considered to be associated with human sensibility, which distinguishes the human from the quote-unquote so-called intellectual intuition of God. Long story short, according to Kant, intellectual intuition, which is possessed by God and God alone, is the capacity to produce ontologically, to bring into existence that which is thought. Whatever God thinks and wills comes into being. On the contrary, human beings, and non-human animals, we should say as well, of course, are finite in the precise sense that we do not have this prerogative. We don't have this power. Our capacity to think and to sense is finite in the sense that there's a passive dimension to it. Sensibility, in Kant's theory of the faculties, as you might know, is fundamentally passive in the sense that I do not control what comes into my perceptual field or sensible field with complete autonomy. As it were, the world places a limit, and I am bombarded by this input of stimuli, in which I then, of course, posteriorly form a quote-unquote representation of the world. Our human understanding is likewise finite in the sense we do not have the prerogative to simply bring into existence that which we think. So there is a constitutive, let's say, limitation to both the activity of our intellect and the passivity of our sensory intuition that distinguishes us from the divine. And it is this, quote unquote, finitude of the human subject, this limitation of the faculties, that explains or that marks a sort of methodological limit into the kind of investigation that is propedeutic for Kant in relation to metaphysics proper. In other words, as you know, Kant's critical turn is supposed to, first of all, delineate the limits of experience before we can cross over into the realm of metaphysics or positive scientific inquiry. And this means, first of all, delineating how it is that the different faculties through which us, human subjects, experience the world are limited by specific modalities. So sensibility and the intellect being the two major ones, which there's the third mysterious one, the imagination. I shall not inquire into that. Now, this process through which finitude becomes a central topic and a propedeutic, let's say even necessity, a methodological necessity, coincides with the progressive disenchantment of the world. Many times, or at many different moments, it will no longer just simply be an epistemological problem, but it will be extended into an existential predicament once more. For after all, perhaps our finitude bars not only access to the reality and grace of the Lord or the transcendent being of God, but it could potentially actually delimit our very capacity for knowledge. It could delimit also our ambitions for political action and emancipation. This progressive realization of the limits of the human, in other words, coincides with a process of secularization, a more general process of secularization concerning man's image of itself in the world and of nature itself as disenchanted, in which further, let's say, discoveries in the sciences, but also in philosophy, show us or display human existence as desolate, as fundamentally benighted, abandoned, and part of a desolate nature without a God, destined to be a floating ephemeral star in a cosmological horizon in an ever-expanding cosmos that's inhabited by dead matter, and so on and so forth. The confrontation with finitude, this reckoning with the fact that we are, after all, alone, finite, limited, perhaps incapable of accessing the knowledge that we would need in order to actually know what's going on. This confrontation with finitude initiates, therefore, also a kind of vector of retroactive critique, where philosophy will always detect in former iterations of its quote-unquote critical project something like a residual piety, something like still too human, too pious, too, let's say, theistic compulsion to delude itself and to not cope properly with its own reality. There's a comment in the chat. Let me make sure that there's nothing I need to leave. Ishpreet, something for this lecture. Okay. Thank you, Ishpreet, for your presence. So, in other words, we must confront our finitude to the full extent, and this confrontation requires perhaps methodological tools that go beyond those that were forged by Kant in the, let's say, genesis of the critical method. We have to sharpen, in fact, our critical knives to figure out the extent of the limitations that afflict the human. And it is in this context that Thanatropism becomes more and more intense. As I mentioned, this is an extension or an exploration that is tangential as well and runs in parallel with many of the topics that I explore in my second book, The Structure and Thought Toward a Materialist Theory of Representational Cognition, where I'm very interested in examining not only this one particular vector of materialist thought that aligns itself with an exploration of human finitude, but more generally also all of the critiques of the representational picture of thinking that was laid out and put forward by Kant himself. So it is in this broad context that I will be organizing the seminar, but also taking the seminar in a more expansive terrain of texts and materials that in the book I did not have a chance to explore more thoroughly because of its different scope and broader scope. So let's continue then to say a few things about this preparatory, let's say, elevator pitch history of modern philosophy. So after Kant, as we know, this process of this vector of secularization, the confrontation with finitude becomes radicalized. And that is a central claim that I think is going to guide the seminar. To understand how a true, authentic confrontation with finitude presupposes a radicalization of the critical method, as I mentioned a moment ago. And this implies, among other things, that we must not only explore the intellectual and sensory modalities of experience that characterize human cognition and the limits of these faculties or modalities of experience, but we must extend the critical investigation into other forms of pragmatic, existential, affective, libidinal, textual, social, cultural mediation that determine who we are in the world and the limits of our experience. And as we know, the limits of our experience determines the kind of beings that we are, our potentials, but also the limits of those potentials, the potentials of both what we can think, what we can feel, and what we can do. The pragmatic limitations of the human that are imposed by this methodological extension of the Kantian critical approach and critique of metaphysics is going to be of capital importance in the seminar. Why? Because it is in this delineation of what the human cannot do or cannot aspire to do at a practical level, at the level of praxis, is what is going to delimit also its political aspirations. And as some of the registers that we're going to see are therefore going to have two sides of the story to juggle that seem to be, at least on first encounter, in tension with one another. On the one hand, a kind of pursuit towards a materialist theory that copes with, quote unquote, a disenchanted reality. This is at the theoretical level. On the other hand, what happens to human agency, subjectivation, politics, intersubjectivity, etc., once we have, quote unquote, relinquished or delineated the capacities for action in such a way in which perhaps the utopian ideals of humanity become problematized in ways that we did not expect as a result precisely of this materialist, quote unquote, perspective, or at the very least of the limits that are imposed by our critical acumen into the nature of human cognition and human experience. So the conditions for this kind of exacerbated critical approach is going to require both a radicalization of the Kantian approach to include forms of mediation, experiential mediation, not explored by Kant on the one hand, and on the other hand, a secondary move, which I think is of extreme interest and importance, which is that there's going to be a resilient, let's say, observation by some of these thinkers, by the thinkers that I've selected, to avoid trying to hypostasize any of these faculties or limits, to try to overcome those limits by transposing them into nature as such. What do I have in mind? After Kant, the compulsion arises routinely. We see this already in the immediate, let's say, aftermath of German idealism after Kant, but certainly also in the Sturm und Drang in Germany with Nietzsche and others, to try to adopt a vitalist strategy as a kind of answer of, or as an alternative mode of radicalization with regards to critical philosophy. And that involves, and I will be more specific in a few moments when I introduce some terminology that's going to be of a technical nature, that means that there's a kind of transposition of certain aspects of human or animal life or cognition into nature as a whole. That, in other words, perhaps we can overcome the limits, the epistemic, properly, limits that Kant laid out for us by extrapolating the faculties and the human abilities and limits that we associated with us or with animal cognition, and to identify them as more general properties of the world as a whole. In other words, enacting a kind of metaphysical transvaluation, as Nietzsche would say, of the epistemic limitations that Kant identified in his investigation of the faculties and of the transcendental subject. Now, at the same time, although Nietzsche is oftentimes identified as one of the sources of modern philosophical vitalism, quite ironically also, he is also considered to be one of the, let's say, precursors to thinking about nihilism in a, let's say, rigorous manner. Now, there's a lot, of course, I'm sure you know, debate. Nietzsche was not a nihilist. It is said Nietzsche is actually, diagnosing the problem of nihilism and nihilism as a crisis of European values. We all know this. The more interesting contention is that, in fact, that which, among others, was elaborated by Gilles Deleuze, but I think he's right in his exegetical excursion, and especially when you look at fragments from The Will to Power, in that there is such a thing as an active nihilism at work in Nietzsche's text. But in any case, one of the things that Nietzsche does, regardless of where you position his own active nihilism or whether he was a nihilist or not, the problem of nihilism becomes central, and partially because of what I had already mentioned a moment ago. Once the problem of human finitude enters the center stage, and it progressively erodes the old axiological, let's say, coordinate system of the scholastic metaphysics and theological worldview that had animated Western philosophy and culture for centuries, there is a crisis of values. There is a sense of despair. And eventually, even Nietzsche will say, a sense of weariness, right? Modern nihilism begins as a sense of hysterical, let's say, loss of a ground, a free fall or vertigo before the removal of the ground that, although Kant was very much a foundationalist, he inadvertently initiated. Nevertheless, at the same time, this process ends up in something which is familiar to all of us, right? Which is the kind of vape nihilism, as I like to call it. In other words, the nihilism that no longer even feels a sense of dread or anxiety with regards to having lost the foundations or meaning or anything of the sort. That nihilism that, as it were, has grown tired and simply doesn't have any will to fight back or to feel despair or anything anymore. Nihilism is therefore also another of these concepts that I will want to position at the center of the seminar. It will be in tangent, the genealogy of modern Thanatropism I will be following, also a genealogy of modern nihilism. And nihilism understood here as a historical predicament in which oftentimes the fate of Western culture, and maybe even more so humanity as a whole, or terrestrial life even, or planetary existence as a whole, or even the history of the material universe is decided. Nihilism becomes therefore the name not only for a crisis of values, although it begins in this as having this sense in the work of Nietzsche, to something that becomes positively affirmed as a new potential, quote unquote, ontological framework or way to think about the future of life on Earth, human existence, and even the universe as a whole. So we're going to see a transvaluation, ironically, of nihilism itself. Begins as a kind of exploration, genealogical exploration of the different phases of this vector of disenchantment in the modern period, but it culminates, or it becomes then transposed, transcribed, and displaced into a variety of other registers in which we find actually something like the possibility of a truly secular and materialist thought by attending to nihilism and affirming nihilism, an affirmation of nihilism as a perhaps what Ray Brazier calls at the end a speculative opportunity and not merely a crisis of values. So, summarizing a series of constitutive subsidiary theses, we can say that the eschatological materialisms that we will be exploring constitute a series of attempts to overcome, taken together with their differences and their chronological progression, notwithstanding, if we were to say something concerning that which they share in common, is an attempt to overcome three constitutive positions or theses. The first is very clearly humanism. And as I understand humanism here, very broadly understood, it's the thesis according to which the human is the privileged agent of or mode of existence in the natural order, if not an exception to this order. Humanism remains at the heart in modern philosophy in a perhaps displaced manner as a way to think of, in other words, a kind of human exceptionalism in the ontological order. Perhaps we are not children of the gods, perhaps we are alone in this universe, but nevertheless, rational creatures that we are reserved a special place in this universe. And perhaps the powers of reason are unbound and enable us to access ever wider epistemic, ontological, and practical horizons of technological reinvention, urban growth, emancipation at the political level. Well, this humanist narrative of a kind of optimism and importance awarded to the human, despite the vector of secularization, these historical eschatological materialist narratives will challenge progressively. And as I mentioned, one of the things that will occur is a kind of retroactive, let's say, unveiling of the residual humanist conceits that former material attempts at a materialist perspective had harbored within themselves, nevertheless. So there's this kind of process of playing detective with regards to the past. You see, you thought you were radically purged. You had purged all these spooks and ghosts altogether. Think again. Here they are. Let me show them for you. The second vector, which is very much continuous with the first, is anthropomorphism. And this is the thesis according to which reality as a whole or partially is modeled on human features or faculties, sensibility, intellection, memory, decision-making. Understood as a metaphysical thesis or ontological thesis, anthropomorphism is an expression of what the French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux has named in a new typology of philosophical positions, subjectalism. Subjectalism is, as we will see, also I will make reference to Meillassoux in a second, subjectalism is a mode of thinking that extrapolates, as I mentioned, the human faculties or aspects of human experience and their limitations into nature as a whole. And this process of ontological transposition, projection, or extrapolation is going to be what is challenged by these eschatological materialisms. At the same time, and again, in continuity with this retroactive critical process, one of the things we're going to see is that eschatological materialists are going to be very savvy at also detecting in their former iterations or predecessors, gestures that do not fully evict and evacuate anthropomorphism. So that's another thing that's going to be recurrent and evince in a kind of ironic movement of radicalization. The third one, obviously, is idealism, which is a much more familiar position. It is also a kind, if you think about it, and Meillassoux certainly does, of subjectalism in the sense that I just mentioned, because idealism is, as I define it here, the thesis according to which being is said to be conceptually structured. This thesis is sometimes referred to as conceptual realism, which is a term that is mostly used in analytic philosophy to describe positions such as the thought of Hegel. So it's very interesting because idealism presupposes a kind of realism, right? It is about the nature of the structure of the world as such. The claim is that idealism says that the structure of the world as such has conceptual shape all along. What that means specifically varies from idealist to idealist, but it presupposes therefore what philosophers call conceptual realism. And this means that the conceptual structures, the inferential relations, the semantic, in other words, contents that we associate with conceptual behavior and rational, let's say, interactions and at the discursive level in human life are projected or extrojected into the world as such, so that we can say that the world itself becomes modeled on propositional states and attitudes of sapient beings. This idealist conceit of looking at the world as somehow modeled or structured in the same way that our linguistic or linguaformal states, propositional states and attitudes are formed, is going to be a kind of residual idealistic conceit that drags well into the 20th century. And not only in these idealist, quote unquote, deviations of the 19th century, such as Hegel after Kant. Now, I said that this retroactive critique, by virtue of which materialism finds its former iteration still too pregnant or contaminated with theological, with anthropomorphic idealist residues and humanist residues, becomes therefore a condition to attain an authentic materialism. The reason why these eschatological narratives and Thanatropism is so interesting to me as a philosopher is because it shows us, among other things, how difficult it really is to be a materialist. That materialism is not just something that, as it were, one can be by simply affirming the being of matter or something like that. Now, this means that materialism has certain set of demands, methodological demands that it must meet, but we are not even conscious of what methodological demands it must meet. This requires itself philosophical reflection. In other words, materialism, like anything else, is not a self-evident concept, even though it might sound and be understood in the most, let's say, quite vernacular and general sense as having like a kind of obvious meaning, which is that reality is materially structured, right? Now, in its most quote-unquote crass or coarse-grained formulation, we can say that materialism has been, across the history of philosophy, defined in terms of two theses. A thesis, it's actually one thesis because these two subsidiary theses are part of a general picture. And these are the two that I have in the slide here. The first sense is that being is set in one sense. This is the thesis that traditionally is named ontological univocity. Being is set in one sense and one sense alone. And this is said in, doesn't just refer to the way we talk about being, even though the way it is formulated in its scholastic locution suggests it is. What it's actually saying is that being, reality as a whole, has one nature and one nature alone. In other words, it is a claim against dualist or pluralist ontological perspectives. I think somebody wants to join the chat. Should I click admit or is somebody else doing it for me?
I did it, it's fine.
Okay, cool. I can click if you if moving forward in case you're not, but
No, it's fine. I'm here. I can do it. So if there's anyone else, I can admit them. Don't worry about it.
okay, great. Thank you. And sorry, so going back, so these two theses. First, there is the thesis of ontological univocity, being is said in one sense alone. This is, of course, a thesis that goes back to Duns Scotus in its explicit formulation, even though there are materialisms and univocal, quote unquote, ontologies and metaphysics before Duns Scotus, of course. But it is a alternative or an explicit, therefore, let's say, challenge to any dualist or pluralist ontology. So that's the first sense, the first subsidiary thesis. The second is that this one sense in which being is spoken of is specified by our concept of matter, right? So being is said in one sense, and that one sense is given to you by whatever we understand matter to be. Now, obviously, this is a very, let's say, coarse-grained definition precisely because the moment we ask ourselves, well, what is matter? We realize that across the history of philosophy and science also, matter has been given extraordinarily divergent formulations, meanings, right? And therefore, materialism has come to mean a number of different things, sometimes even diametrically opposed things. So in the interest of trying to bring some quote-unquote clarity, at least to this issue, it's, I think, instructive to take a cursory glance at the history of some of these formulations, just to realize that matter is not just one of these things that, people disagree about what matter is in the same way that people might disagree about what the weather will be tonight, but it is something that is actually, in fact, so semantically divergent that what some people call matter would be exactly what another philosopher might say that's precisely what matter is not. Let us begin with the most obvious classical example, which is the Aristotelian example from classical ancient Greek metaphysics, where matter is defined as hyle, that's the Greek word, and which is part of an ateological register. Actually, matter is defined as the first of the four forms of causation, aidion. And it is that which is defined more precisely as formless in itself, but that which receives the action of form. Now, this might seem rather familiar to those of you who are more familiar with modern philosophy, because it turns out that matter in this sense is quite closely defined, or defined in close proximity to the way in which, for example, Kant defines sensibility. Remember, sensibility is a passive medium, as a sensory manifold, unformed in itself, that receives the action of form, the forms of intuition, space and time, which are already a kind of, Kant will say, a kind of intellectual activity pregnant within our sensibility itself before we even think in language or anything like that, as lofty as that. So matter in this sense is the formless. It's that which is a passive medium which receives the action of form. And matter plus form is substance, which is the basic ontological primitive of Aristotle. Hopefully we all know our Aristotle here. Another position that's very common here is, of course, physicalism, what today is called physicalism. And this is a kind of subsidiary, a kind of subset of naturalism, which is a broader position. Physicalism is the thesis according to which what matter pertains, or what matter is said to be, is defined by physics, by the field of physics. This is, of course, a position that is very popular among certain branches of analytic philosophy today, and many of which are of great interest to the authors that we will be examining in the seminar. For example, Ray Brazier. This physicalist perspective can sometimes be of an eliminativist nature or a reductionist nature. In other words, it can claim that, you know, any other register, the biological or the quote-unquote chemical or the social, become all reduced methodologically to the physical, that there is in other words, an operation of conceptual reduction, where you can show that the concepts of all these other domains can be actually logically, semantically reduced to the concepts of fundamental physics, say, or they can be eliminated altogether. This is the more radical position, eliminativism, right? In which people say, and people do say these things actually, that, for example, social phenomena, chemical phenomena, et cetera, all these other registers outside of physics that make appeal to entities, relations, and properties that do not belong to the physical domain or that are tangential to it, are, strictly speaking, epiphenomenal at best, useful fictions, or just nonsense at worst. The broader position in this same territory is naturalism, of course, which is that matter pertains to the phenomena described by the natural sciences, not just physics, perhaps, so not physicalism, but the natural sciences. Sorry. The next position is of particular interest because here we notice a first irony, which is Platonism. Very strange. Platonism has been heralded as a kind of the exemplary, let's say, case of both idealism, of dualism, and more recently of materialism. Although this, I have to say, is a relatively recent development. What is Platonism? Platonist materialism in this regard. It is the thesis that matter pertains to mathematical idealities. Numbers, sets, types, classes, universals, whatever it is that mathematics, formal logic, maybe even computerized languages can tell us exists, is actually the stuff of nature. This is a position that is, for example, might be familiar to those of you who know something like Badiou's quote-unquote materialist dialectics, as he calls it. He very clearly, explicitly identifies being as pure multiplicity, and pure multiplicity is nothing except that which is explained or made explicit by the ideography and formalization of set theory proposed by Sermello and Frenkel. So Sermello-Frenkel axiomatization of set theory equals ontology, and ontology equals the study of being qua pure multiplicity. But there's also more, let's say, less extravagant positions in this terrain. For example, in analytic philosophy, there's this thing called structural realism, which is actually very much at the center of the exploration of my book. It's an examination of different forms of structural materialism that occur in the analytic and continental philosophical traditions. Now, structural realism or structuralist materialism might be something that resonates with you with post-war France, and you would be right. In fact, even Badiou, we could say, follows downstream from these appropriation of quote-unquote structuralist methods into philosophy as they were into the social sciences. In the analytic tradition, structural realism is a tradition that begins in the philosophy of science, following downstream from John Worrell, for example, but which essentially claims that the reality of the world, ontic structural realism to be more precise, is structured mathematically. That the ultimate constituents of the real, that being, in other words, is not simply are not simply individual entities with properties or substances, but on the contrary, they're structures, mathematical structures. That mathematics, in other words, describes the intrinsic structure of the world, which is, after all, not an extravagant claim. You can trace it back to Galileo, and in fact, to Plato himself, right? The idea is that mathematical idealities, for example, those of geometry, are actually not simply abstractions of the real, but they capture the invariant properties of, say, the spatial world itself, the formal reality of the world itself. Similarly, as we know, Galileo claims that nature itself is written in mathematical language, right? Which is not textual idealism, but a kind of structural realism that claims that whatever it is that mathematics and the formalized sciences tell us is real, and that the reality of the world is therefore not substance, but structure. This continues, actually. Deleuze holds a version of this thesis, actually, surprisingly, even though he's a vitalist, but he's also a thanatropist in another sense. Anyway, we'll get to that in the seminar. But one of the interesting things here, right, is that there is a very clear question of what happens to, let's say, materialism once we have let go of substance metaphysics. The critique of substance metaphysics initiated by Heidegger in the continental tradition, but which follows in its own trajectory in the analytic tradition and in the sciences themselves, involves a kind of rethinking of what we consider materiality to be. And if matter is no longer identifiable with discrete individuated substances, which are modeled, again, in the Aristotelian manner, as passive matter receiving the action of form, substances with properties, qualities, and accidents, then what is matter? And one of the predominant theses today is that it is, in fact, mathematical, structural in nature. We have historical materialism, of course, which is another variation. Matter pertains to the dynamics of production, which encompasses both natural and socio-economic becoming. The articulation between labor, the ownership of means of production, the very technical, let's say, machinery in which labor and technology are organized. All of this, the historical materialists will say, provides for the first time a truly materialist view on history and its development, and the dynamics or dialectic that actually unfolds in real history against the idealist, quote unquote, readings of history that you get from Hegel or from the German Romantics more general. And finally, there's vitalist materialisms, which again is a kind of strange new subset. It has become exorbitantly popular in recent decades because of the works of a group of people that call themselves the new materialisms or the new materialists, right? And this is to say that matter pertains to the dynamics of life and not just life considered as a subset of phenomena studied concerning nature in the biological domain, but furthermore that life is a more pervasive category, that life is in fact something that does not reduce to the biological domain. And in this regard, you find not only the new materialists that are oftentimes of Nietzschean or of Deleuzian bent, but more recently, for example, fellow Latin American philosopher Gabriel Catren has published a magnificent work of philosophy titled Pleidomatica that is an explicit attempt to align materialism and vitalism in a kind of reconciliation of Kant and Spinoza, which I really recommend everybody should read if anybody wants to read one of the great works of systematic philosophy today. I should stop here for 1 second just in case there's any questions here. Also, I want to know how I'm doing with time. For how long have I been talking? Probably for already about 40 minutes, right?
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
50 minutes, 45 actually.
45.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question.
Sure. Isidora, by all means.
Yeah, so I would like to ask if you use the term disenchantment in the sense of the Frankfurt School, like referring to the dialectic of enlightenment by Horkheimer and Adorno. That would be my question.
I did not use it thinking of them directly, although of course they use the term, right? And more generally, I'm thinking of narratives of disenchantment as any kind of narrative, philosophical or otherwise, really, certainly these narratives were by no means, let's say, reducible to philosophical narratives that tell a story about modernity as one that coincides with a vector of not only secularization and demystification, overcoming theology and all these things, technological urban development and all these other things, but also a sense of a movement towards a crisis of values and the axiological framework that organize life in Western cultures, and then, of course, expanded across the world as a whole. So disenchantment, again, has this weight that Adorno and Horkheimer in the Dialectic of Enlightenment problematize, because one of the things that they're going to say is that what we take to be just a vector of secularization with regards to modern science is in fact not as quote unquote disenchanted as one would think, right? That in other words, there is within modernity itself and this whole history of modernity also a kind of latent sense of continuity with the past. This thesis is incidentally something that I associate also with Heidegger, even though the Frankfurt School wants to take a very sharp, quote unquote, separation from it. Because if you think about it, what Heidegger does for us, and this already, even Nietzsche does this for us, right, is to say something like, the orthodox traditional narrative was to say that with modernity, there's a break with the pre-modern world. Again, the pre-modern world considered to be immature, superstitious, dogmatic, whatever you want. You find the clearest expression of this shift in attitude and this optimism, right? And for example, Kant's Was ist Aufklärung, right? What is enlightenment? Where he says humanity has been in a perpetual state of immaturity, but now in the modern period, in the Enlightenment, we have entered a vector of maturity, of enlightenment, precisely. Well, what Nietzsche and what Heidegger after Nietzsche will say is, actually, no. Actually, the modern period is just an exacerbation of the metaphysical impulse that begins in the ancient Greeks and that becomes recoded, displaced, potentiated, and runs amok, if you will, in the technical development, techno-capitalist development of culture, but it is by no means a kind of interruption. It is actually it's schizophrenic, let's say, takeoff, right? That kind of movement is what I was talking about, and how it is that and what I'm going to actually be referring to in the seminar itself is how it is that these quote unquote thanatropic materialists precisely respond to the history of modernity, oftentimes in this revisionary manner, in which what they will say is, no, actually, modern philosophy oftentimes functioned as a reactive movement in reaction to the discovery of the void that was, found. In other words, if modern science really was a kind of crisis of foundations, what philosophy did oftentimes, and not just philosophy, but I'll be focusing on the philosophy. What philosophy oftentimes did was desperately try to restitute a ground of some sort, right? And what we actually have to do is to detect this residual pasture of humanism, anthropomorphism, idealism, whatever, and shatter it to pieces to truly cope with the consequences of what a real modern break with the past, with the metaphysical past, theological past would entail, right? And that's the vector of disenchantment that I think coincides with the development of not only modern history, but specifically with nihilism considered as a predicament for the human species and for maybe even materiality as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your question. Well, so I've been talking for quite some time. I think, let me see if there's anything of high importance that I need to say. I'll just show you some stuff that I was going to, well, anyway, so let me just say a few words about the organization of the seminars I have seen. Let me pull up the syllabus very quickly. Just give me 1 second for this. So what I want to simply let you know is, actually, I'm having trouble accessing my cloud drive. So, well, in any case, I can describe for you the major configurations of thought that we will be looking at, and you can look at those into specific texts, as I don't have time anyway to get into the specific text. So, in the first session, I want to propose a kind of introductory, again, sort of revisiting the central claims and concepts that I've already been mentioning, the fundamental, let's say, historical background, but also delve a little bit deeper and clarify the pending concepts and typologies that will be nurturing the conversation throughout the weeks. In the second instance, I want to begin by studying a first constellation of thought by looking at both Nietzsche and Freud, specifically at a text from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and a very famous, some would say even the two elementary texts of Nietzsche, but I think that text actually includes something that is important of Nietzsche, which is On Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, which I think that in that text you see not only this famous fable of the end, which is interestingly a kind of prequel or a kind of, opening preface to the actual essay, but it encodes a myth that will be reiterated later by people like Lyotard, by Ray Brazier, and even Nick Land. So this first configuration of thought let's say, Thanatropist thought, is meant to look at these two registers, of course, psychoanalytic, and on the other hand, this quote-unquote philosophical / genealogical register, both of which try to unearth a sense of, let's say, priority of death, or a kind of sense in which death overrules the ambitions of human intellect, and that underlies, in fact, the visions of the human intellect. I'm in particular interested to see how, in the case of Nietzsche, death becomes a kind of leveling playing field in relation to idealist philosophy and German idealism, but on the other hand, how for Freud, Thanatropism and the account of the drives becomes a way to radicalize and upset the modern philosophical human subject, understood again as a kernel organized primarily of intuition, understanding, reason, and sensibility. In the second week, I want to look at the configuration of thought that is organized around Heidegger and his own account of being toward death. This is a phenomenological, existential register, as we say. Of course, it finds its most elaborate expression in Being and Time, although there are other places, and in the second division of Being and Time. And this is an account, I think, that is of great importance because it really tries to do exactly what I mentioned before, which is to rekindle the valences of transcendental philosophical questioning concerning the limits of human experience, but go way further than Kant did, to actually define finitude as the condition for individuation of the human, which is something that is quite radical. In tandem with this, I want to also be looking at other texts from the French, let's call it French, post-structuralist and post-structuralist, let's say, kernel or sequence. Among these, we will be looking at a text by Deleuze himself, the second chapter from Difference and Repetition, in which there is a very explicit extrapolation of the death drive as a kind of synthesis of time, and a re-elaboration of our ontology and metaphysics of time in an account of death. However, we're going to see how it is that Deleuze, in this regard, accommodates death as the motor for a becoming without boundaries. It is a thanatropism that becomes, not dialectically, but in a strange empiricist, quasi-empiricist register, reconciled with vitalism. So I think that the Deleuzian text in particular provides a kind of strange short circuit of these two things that we consider to be essentially antinomies or opposites. In tandem with this, a very important text by Jean-François Lyotard concerning, as you know, one of the things that preoccupied Lyotard, among other things, is the question of extinction, of human extinction on planetary Earth. Adjacent to this trajectory and following through our reading of Lyotard and being human, is going to be an exploration of Bataille and a text by the Sith Lord himself, Nick Land, The Curse of the Sun, which comes from his book, The Thirst for Annihilation. In Bataille, we find a strange kind of case of what we call speculative sociology, if you will. Just like you can say that, Wilfrid Sellars does speculative anthropology and different, and Freud does speculative psychology, or you will. But in the Accursed Share, but George Bataille famously develops this account of what he calls a general economy that tries to go beyond Marx and trying to define the material limits of any kind of productivity on Earth, not just human productivity, but any kind of production that can take place on a planetary scale, which ultimately finds its quote unquote energetic reservoir, but also limit in the sun. Solar thanatropisms are going to become very, very interesting. And also, they have an element of beauty that I find endearing. It's going to be radicalized by the work of Nick Land in a virulent nihilism, as he's going to call it, which is also an energetic materialism. And Nick Land, and this is the Nick Land that still was not, brain fried, essentially develops in this text something that is remarkable, which is an ontology of thermodynamics informed by the work of Ludwig Boltzmann. Boltzmann was, one of the supreme theorists of thermodynamics in the 20th century, accommodated to information theoretic formalization of entropy. And this is going to make Land think about the concept of extinction and the limits of life on Earth and planetary existence in a completely radical register. And following from that, I'm going to take a look at a more recent configuration of thought, which is, let's say, follows downstream from this, but also from a kind of rekindling or an attempted rekindling of the rationalist legacy of philosophy, trying to usurp and to rekindle philosophical materialism against this kind of anti-philosophical gesture that was presented by Land. Land is going to very, very strongly present his own version of nihilism and this materialism as somehow going beyond philosophy or being non-philosophical in tenor. But this last configuration of philosophy, of new materialist and neo-rationalist philosophy, I'm going to be looking at two pieces, one by Ray Brazier from his famous text and only book, Nihil Unbound. The other one, a text by Kenton Meyasu that was published after Finitude, after Finitude, but which is actually a very important text to understand a new typology of thought and philosophical thought, in which he's going to define the kingdom of the dead as the root of thinking of not only what he's going to call a speculative materialism, but also a speculative materialism that is both dialectical in nature and physicalist in the Platonist sense. Platonist, mathematical Platonist, in the Badiouian sense, if you will, speculative / dialectical materialism. So in all of these registers, death, extinction, and nihilism are going to function as organizing, quote unquote, concepts in an attempt to reconstitute the valences of materialism and to potentiate the disenchantment of the world to its ultimate consequences and extent. Anyway, that's the kind of extended preview of the seminar. Hopefully this was helpful to some of you. I am more than happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. I don't know if you guys are collecting questions from anybody watching the streams or not. But if not, I'm more than happy to receive emails if you have any questions about the seminar in the coming weeks. And, you can bother me in any social media that you can find me.
All right, thank you, Daniel, for that wonderful and brilliant lecture. I can say that I'm very much looking forward to the credit courses this spring. So I would like to give the floor for any questions to the Zoom participants. If not, Meriton, could you check the live stream if there are any questions there? And yeah.
Thank you very much, Isidora.
So if there are no questions here, are there any on the live stream? Or I can.
No, Konstantinos just extended a thank you. Thanks to you for your attendance, Konstantinos.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, if there are no questions for the moment, we
Yeah,
can
maybe I can
wrap up.
check the live stream as well.
Sure.
Give me a moment because usually I don't do that, but now I do, I guess. But let's.
There isn't any question there. I checked.
Oh, there are none? Okay, great. So I think we can wrap it up in that case, or
Fine by me?
I think we can wrap it up in that case if there are no questions. And yeah, maybe someone will reach out via email. So
Will these be recorded and then reposted so people can
yeah,
watch
I
it?
think they will be posted on YouTube if I'm not mistaken. But
Okay,
yeah, they are being recorded for sure. So yeah,
excellent.
anyone can come
Excellent.
back to them.
Yeah, I will share after so that if anybody
Yeah,
who
yeah,
after the fact sees this can reach out in case they have any
yeah. Sounds awesome. Yeah. So yeah, it was a pleasure to have you all, and it was a pleasure to have you teach. So see you on spring and have an amazing day.
So you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.